Hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which country you are based. Welcome to this second online lecture of this Why We Care About Care online lecture series, which are organized by the UN Women Training Center in order to discuss this critical topic for development and for gender equality. Today we have with us Boram Lee. She's Disability Program Officer at the Women's Refugee Commission, and she will be talking about caregiving related to disability situations of disability, and she will provide a summary of key findings from field research conducted in forced displacement settings related to the intersection of gender, caregiving, and disability. And after that, she will provide some recommendations for programming. Let me introduce Boram Lee to you before listening to her. She's, as I already said, she's the Disability Program Officer at the Women's Refugee Commission, and she has been working to advance the rights and dignity of refugees and displaced persons with disability through action at global and country level as well. Since November 2015, Boram has been providing technical assistance to operational humanitarian organizations to support the inclusion and participation of women, children, and youth with disabilities affected by conflict, and supporting networks of women with disabilities to better engage and advocate on issues affecting refugee women and girls with disabilities. And prior to that, prior to joining the Women's Refugee Commission, Boram has over 7 years experience in East Africa and Middle East, managing humanitarian projects for international NGOs in the areas of camp management and community-based protection, community-based rehabilitation, community services and inclusion advocacy for the International Rescue Committee, Relief International, Premier Urgence, and Help Aid and Handicap International. So she's got a broad experience that, and we are lucky that she will share this with us today. But prior to giving her the floor, let me give you a few basics on how to use this platform, the GoToWebinar platform. As you can see, there's a blue button which allows you to view the presentation in full screen mode. And then you've got that orange arrow. When the orange arrow is pointing to the right, you can click on it, and you can dock it, so you won't see the console to better see the screen. So if the console impedes you to see properly the screen, you can click on the orange arrow pointing to the right. And again, if you want to see again the console, to have all the console and all the possibilities that it gives you, you can click on the orange arrow pointing to the left. Today, we will have 2 ways for interacting and for making any questions to Boram or making any comments. You can see in the console that there's a question box. So you can just click on the plus to ensure that the questions are visible, and you can type your questions there. And we will take all your questions and share them with Boram at the end of her presentation. So you can type your question at any moment during her lecture, and we will, as I said, we will keep them and we will share them with Boram at the end of the presentation. And the other way in which you can interact is just by raising your hand and making your question aloud to her. But this, you will be able to do it just at the end of the presentation, during the Q&A session, okay? So not during the presentation, but at the end of the presentation. So if you want to speak aloud and to share your comments or your questions with us, not by typing them, but just by speaking, you just need to click on that icon, which shows a little hand, and we will unmute your microphones, so you will be able to speak. But if there's any problem with your voice system, we will ask you to type your question, so we don't lose time just trying to fix those kind of issues. So, and I think that's everything you need to know to enjoy the presentation. So Baram, I will give you the screen now. We are really happy, as we said, to have you with us today, and thanks very, very much for accepting our invitation to give this lecture. So yeah, you've got the screen and you've got the floor. Thanks a lot.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Amaya. Thanks to the UN Women Training Center for inviting me to speak today. As Amaya has said, my name is Boram Lee. I'm a program officer with the Women's Refugee Commission. Before presenting, I thought I'd share just a few words about our organization and what we do. The Women's Refugee Commission is a research and advocacy organization that works to improve the lives and protect the rights of women, children, and youth, including with disabilities, displaced by conflict and crisis. We research their needs, identify solutions, and advocate for programs and policies to strengthen their resilience and drive change in humanitarian practice. So the disability program seeks to advance the rights and dignity of refugees and displaced persons with disabilities through research and advocacy initiatives that develop their capacity to lead full lives and to make meaningful contributions to their communities. So we do this by conducting participatory action research to engage persons with disabilities, their families, and affected communities in identifying needs and solutions. We conduct trainings and workshops with international organizations, as well as with local in-country disability organizations. We analyze, document, and share lessons learned with a wider humanitarian community. We advocate for change globally with donors, policymakers, and humanitarian workers. And we amplify the voices of refugees with disabilities and facilitate their participation and voice in all of our activities. And so before going over, sorry, one second. Before going over what some of our own research says about caregiving, gender and disability in displaced settings, I will first go over some key concepts that are important for us in our work, as well as some of the relevant international frameworks and principles that we use to guide our work. Then I will go into the findings, recommendations, before opening this up for questions. So first, most importantly, is the concept related to disability. We go by the definition as provided by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Disability is considered an evolving concept and results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. From this perspective, we know that persons with disabilities are not necessarily vulnerable because of their impairment, but because of the presence of these types of barriers, which often reinforce each other and results in people with disabilities having less power and status in society, are marginalized and even directly targeted for violence. Some common barriers to access, participation, and full enjoyment of rights can be attitudes. So this can be stereotyping, stigma, prejudice, discrimination, communication. So this is when the language or providing single mediums of communication, such as displays of text. Physical, this is access, such as steps, lack of access to convenient transportation, distance and convenience of program delivery or services. So policy can serve as a barrier. It's the lack of awareness or enforcement of existing laws, regulations or policies that require programs and activities to be accessible. Programmatic, so lack of specific services to meet people's needs, inconvenient scheduling, insufficient time, attitudes and level of awareness and understanding by service providers. They can be social, so the conditions in which people live, learn, and work, including presence of poverty and violence. They can be economic, being able to afford services and or transport to access services. So then, when we think about gender, disability, and displacement, we know that gender, in addition to age, and situations of displacement are important dimensions of a person's power and status in relationships, households, and communities in which they live. Some characteristics of displacement we found to be particularly important are related to legal status, right to work, loss of networks. It can be things like change in social and physical environment, insecurity, increased likelihood of new impairments or disabilities, loss of social support structures, just to name a few. As related to disability, we have structural inequality, negative attitudes, perceptions of incapacity, social exclusion, dependence on caregivers, in addition to others as well. And then in gender, structural inequality, social discrimination, gender roles, concepts of femininity, masculinity, sexuality, control over resources, and decision-making. These all have an impact on power and status in relationships. We think that an intersectional analysis is more helpful to help us understand the multiple identities and experiences of persons with disabilities, including inequality and discrimination between men and women and within subsets of men and women, which may uniquely shape their lived experiences and in turn be leveraged to foster their inclusion in society. So the most important international framework related to persons with disabilities is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2006. To date, I believe it's been ratified by at least 173 countries. The purpose of the convention, as stated in Article 1, is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. The convention marks a major shift in the way societies view persons with disabilities, with the person being the key decision maker in his or her own life. It renders persons with disabilities as rights holders and subjects of law with full participation in formulating and implementing plans and policies that affect them. So just a few, I mean, there's quite a number of articles, I believe there's 50, but just to name a couple of them that might be relevant for us in our discussions today, is Article 5, countries are to recognize that persons are equal under the law and prohibits all discrimination on the basis of disability. It also, articles ensure the equal rights and advancement of women with disabilities, is Article 6. Protecting children with disabilities is related to Article 7. Article 19 states that persons with disabilities must be able to live independently, to be included in the community, to choose where and with whom to live, and to have access to in-home residential and community support services. Article 11 states that states parties are obligated to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk and humanitarian crisis. And then Article 16, in addition, states are obligated to ensure that all protection services are age, gender, and disability sensitive. So in relation to caregiving, Article 19 is probably could be considered the most relevant. It says again that persons with disabilities must be able to live independently, to be included in the community, to choose where and with whom to live, and to have access to in-home, residential, and community support services. So just to highlight why do we care about care in the context of the CRPD, I would highlight 3 points. The first is that individuals with disabilities are caregivers themselves and have their own experiences giving care. The second point is that we're interested in the experience of caregivers of persons with disabilities, as good quality caregiving can foster the rights and inclusion of persons with disabilities, while at the same time acknowledging that caregivers also have their own rights. So recognizing the rights of both individuals with disabilities and the rights of caregivers as being inextricably linked is important for us from a policy and programming perspective. And so we seek a kind of balanced approach to both the rights of individuals with disabilities as well as caregivers. So for us in the humanitarian sector, underlining all humanitarian action are these 4 humanitarian principles. They are derived from international humanitarian law, are the first in the ICRC Red Cross NGO Code of Conduct. They're often embedded in the mission statement and mandates of nearly all humanitarian organizations. So at this stage, they form the basis of consensus among humanitarian agencies as the principles that govern the response from disaster or conflict. And so they are humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. For our purposes, I would say impartiality is probably important for us here. It's the imperative to carry out humanitarian action on the basis of need alone and prioritize the most urgent cases of distress, making no distinctions on the basis of nationality, race, gender, religious freedom, class, or political opinion. So the last sort of international framework that I'll mention is the Agenda for Humanity, which was adopted at the World Humanitarian Summit last year in Istanbul. It's the Secretary General's plan that outlines 5 actions and responsibilities that are needed to reduce the scope of humanitarian need, risk, and vulnerability, and how to achieve them. So outlining one of the core responsibilities, this is core commitment number 3, is to leave no one behind. The Secretary General highlights the rights of refugees, internally displaced persons, migrants, stateless persons, women and girls, children and adolescents, persons with disabilities, and older persons, amongst others who face higher risk of exclusion and vulnerability, and calls on states to enact and implement inclusive laws, strategies, economic and social policies, and safety nets, and to track the progress of disadvantaged groups towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The 4th responsibility is related to the call for a shift in humanitarian and development approaches from delivery aid to ending need, recognizing that forced displacement largely affects low to middle income countries. Humanitarian development, peace and security, and other institutions often work in parallel on different projects, but within the same communities. This commitment recognizes the need to link displacement to development. So when we're thinking about supported and quality caregiving, support and assistance should promote inclusion, and then also the link between humanitarian and development divides. So these international frameworks, concepts, and principles taken together provides the foundational basis of our work, which is very much grounded in a rights-based approach. So the findings that I'm presenting today were based on consultations with women, men, girls, and boys with various types of disabilities, and caregivers from both camp and non-camp contexts with refugees and internally displaced persons. I had originally presented that I'll be drawing findings from 4 displaced settings, but I've actually expanded it a little bit wider since I originally presented the idea to the UN Women Training Center. They will be drawn from these reports. So the first one is the disabilities among refugees and conflict-affected populations. This was one of our foundational research reports from 2008. Then we also did another assessment in Lebanon. This is the disability inclusion in the Syrian refugee response in Lebanon. This is 2013. Then we have disability inclusion, translating policy into practice, which is also drawn from quite a number of different displaced settings. Then we had 3 reports, the intersection of sexual and reproductive health and disabilities from Kenya, Uganda, and Nepal. And then the last one is I see that it is possible building capacity for disability inclusion and gender-based violence programming in humanitarian settings. So with all of these reports, we consulted with both primary and secondary caregivers, in addition to persons with disabilities. This often includes adolescent girls who might provide care for someone with a disability, while the primary caregiver looks for assistance or employment, and we use different approaches to reach each. So in some cases, we might meet with caregivers in a group discussion. Other times, we visit them in their homes so that we can meet with the caregiver and the individual with disabilities together. So just to present some of the findings, I will first talk about the diverse care arrangements that we were able to capture in our consultations, the changing gender roles that have had a large impact on people's lives in displaced settings, and the loss of community support, protection mechanisms, and social isolation that has resulted and lead to a number of protection concerns. So there are people, so we know that in displaced households, there are often very diverse care arrangements. There are people who have long-standing disabilities. This means that they've had disabilities before the onset of a crisis, and then there are others who acquire new disabilities. This can be as a result of injuries and or reduced health care, or as a result of the conflict. And these two groups have very different experiences with care, both as a caregiver and the care receiver. As mentioned previously, persons with disabilities are caregivers. They are fathers, mothers, siblings, and so forth. They face discrimination and stigma and discrimination in relation to their role as caregivers. This can be based on the assumptions that they are not capable or should not become parents. Persons with disabilities sometimes, not always, require care and or assistance, and this assistance is critical to them being included in the community and realizing their rights. Across all our research, we found that in forced displacement settings, the majority of caregivers of persons with disabilities are women and girls, with some exceptions in new crisis where husbands may assume caregiving roles of their wives who have new disabilities or in the absence of other female family members. This was a finding we found in relation to in Jordan. So in humanitarian context, the reality that we found is that there are very limited care and assistance options for persons with disabilities. Caregiving is considered the responsibility of the family, both immediate and extended family. Those who are separated from this network and require assistance are at very high risk of protection concerns. Hence, we see the lack of care and assistance options, as described in Article 19, as a huge gap that needs to be addressed to support the rights of persons with disabilities. So I have a case study from a mother who was part of our GBV project together with the IRC. This is Rahel and her mother, who is age 5. So she says, we have lived here for the last 6 years. Sorry, this was in Miani camp in Ethiopia. Rahel was born here. I have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. I no longer have a husband. I carry my daughter with me on my back wherever I go, anywhere. She's getting bigger, but still it is like she is a part of me. Because of my situation, IRC workers come to my home to visit. We make coffee together. We discuss what it is like to have a child with a disability. They also talk about violence and the risks that my family can face. They always remind me that my child deserves to live in a safe and secure environment. They say that all children should be free from violence, abuse, and neglect. What is very important to me is that the IRC activities help me to better care for my daughter. They also help the community to be more accepting of her. Now children from our neighborhood do not insult her. They do not call her by her disability. They call her by name. Some of the neighbors even come to visit and help me now. It is nice to have people who care about us and want to make our lives better. So this case study I've pulled out is illustrative of individuals and the types of assistance they need to be part of the community, and highlights how the rights of some individuals with disabilities and their caregivers are inextricably linked. We can't just work with one side of this relationship. We found that in situations of forced displacement, changing gender roles within the household impacts all the members in the household in different ways. As an example, when a man acquires a new disability, for example, as a result of the conflict, female family members are required to find employment outside of the home, replacing the male as the household breadwinner. Wives and children may face increased discrimination and risk of violence, as perpetrators can perceive that men with disabilities are not able to fulfill the traditional role as quote-unquote protector of the household. And I have a quote here from a man with disability in a group discussion. The husband usually becomes dependent on the wife. If he needs to pay for something, the wife has to go out to work. It becomes more work for the wife. There are more risks for the wives of men with disabilities because people will take advantage of her. She may become a maid for another family or have to come home late when it is dark. Sometimes society's perception of these wives will change because they don't know why she's going out, and this is not normal here. She may become stigmatized by the community. And so this was a group discussion that took place in Zatri camp in Jordan. So in displacement, we found also that mothers with disabilities report a breakdown in marriage structures. They struggle to access already limited economic opportunities, and in some situations enter into transactional relationships to support their children. In another group discussion, this was in Burundi, men with disabilities disclosed that there is a sense of loss and dignity as the head of family because they are not able to provide for the family's needs. So when we think of loss of community support, this is also, we say that this is very much linked to the protection mechanisms as well as social isolation, apologies. Where they existed, traditional coping mechanisms, including extended families, neighbors, and other caregivers may have broken down either pre-flight, during flight, or on arrival, and little attention is given to rebuilding them. This was one of our findings from our first report in 2008. In Syria, I have another quote from a participant in group discussion with women with disabilities and their female caregivers. In Syria, everyone knew each other and would look after each other. Here, we are surrounded by people from different towns. If something happened to my neighbor, I wouldn't care about them. Similarly, in urban settings in Burundi, parents reported instances when they have had to rely on less familiar neighbors and community members to assist with caregiving, and later discovered that abuse has occurred. The lack of community support has also had implications for caregivers' mental health and psychosocial needs and led to abuse of family members. Caregivers assisting with the daily care of persons with disabilities express stress and anxiety, leading to resentment taken out on persons with disabilities in the form of emotional, physical, or other forms of violence. In relation to protection mechanism, caregivers are often the primary source of protection for persons with disabilities while also experiencing violence themselves. Caregivers of young persons with disabilities, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, can also resort to negative coping mechanisms. This can be in the form of resorting to locking them in their homes to protect them from violence as a coping mechanism. So when we're also thinking about their participation in community life, in all countries, female caregivers living in camp settings were unable to attend community awareness raising and/or women's activities as they must remain at home caring for their family members. They attend community meetings and social activities less frequently, and so miss out on campaigns that raise awareness about preventing violence against women and girls. Community leadership groups, including refugee and women's associations, rarely have representation from individuals with disabilities or their caregivers. Disability associations, where they exist, are often male-dominated and may actively exclude persons with mental and intellectual disabilities. These organizations, we know, often play a central role in communicating information to the community and even appointing representatives to participate in trainings, but as well as other activities. Hence, persons with disabilities and caregivers, but particularly women and girls, are less likely to be included in these activities. The lack of community networks, friends, or service providers increases the vulnerability of female caregivers who may be unable to leave their homes, generate income, or to attend community events and activities with other women. In most situations, these individuals will be the wives or mothers of children and adults with more severe disabilities. In some situations, they also rely on adolescent girls as secondary caregivers, reducing girls' opportunities to access education and other services in the community. A lack of community support and friendships can mean that they do not acquire the information and skills they need or have people that they trust to go to when they experience violence. I will just finish with this quote from Esther from Burundi. She says, "I am the caregiver of my husband who lives with a disability, but this is not my only identity. I am a mother, a leader, and someone who takes pride in her role as a community mobilizer. I have learned many things over the past year, but the biggest lesson I've learned is that the key to everything is empowerment. Empowerment is what has allowed us as women, as caregivers, to better advocate for our family members and ourselves. We know what it is that is best for our families. We know that there is a certain way to encourage other people to better understand our situation. Now we are more confident in ensuring that the needs for our husbands, parents, siblings, and children with disabilities have their needs met, and that we as caregivers are respected, not exploited in that process. So this quote refers to her talking about her multiple and intersecting identities. So just to close, this is some of the recommendations that we've developed based on some of our field research findings. These are practices that we believe strengthen the inclusion of caregivers. The first is to support states to implement Article 19. We know that most displacement is happening in low to middle income countries where adequate support, assistance, and choice is still even lacking in host communities. We think it's important to validate and appreciate caregiving as a critical contribution to the household and to the wider community. We think it's important to strengthen peer networks and social capital, that we need to build social support with other community members, peer support and groups representing caregivers in addition to disabled people's organizations. We need to ensure self-care for caregivers. The activities are designed to integrate that component, that caregivers are supported to be able to exchange with other caregivers on self-care strategies, on how to understand different communication methods for their family members, and that they plan for safety, dignity, and privacy of themselves as well as the persons that they are caring for. We think it's important that women, girls, boys, and men with disabilities and their caregivers are included in the design and implementation and evaluation of programs, and that we must prioritize the inclusion of women with disabilities and female caregivers in economic empowerment programming. So that reaches the end of my presentation today. I think I will hand it over to the organizers for any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Boran. It was very interesting, your contribution on the intersection between gender and disability. And now we open the Q&A section. I think it's going to be many interesting reflections on this issue. So you still didn't ask anything to the speaker, but we encourage you to do it. You can, as Amaya explained to you before, you can either write your questions in a box on the bottom side of the console. You can type your questions, and I will read them and share them to the audience and to Boran, so she will be able to answer you. And okay, I think we have one question. Not yet. So I give you like some minutes, and meanwhile maybe I ask you something, Boran?
Sure, of course.
I've been very interested on this connection between different oppressions, in this sense gender and disability. So I would like to ask you, because there is like a strong nexus between femininity and care. I mean, women as caregivers, but in the case of women with disabilities, when we talk about gender roles, which gender roles are given to them, to women with disabilities? You were talking.
Yes, so I think when you're talking about women with disabilities, I think what we found is that often the kind of gender norms that we found in non-disabled settings often don't apply. So sometimes women with disabilities are not viewed. I think this is part of the barriers I'm speaking about in terms of attitudes. So the gender norms as women who have sexual lives, for example, who have the rights to marry, to have children, and to choose sort of their sexual and reproductive lives and their rights is not often viewed in the context of disability. I think that interplay between gender and disability sometimes can be the reverse sometimes. I think with men with disabilities, we find that it's often the gender norms also has an impact as well. I mean, similarly, that they don't have a right to have families, to also get married, to be the provider of the household.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have one more question from Amaya. Amaya.
Yeah. While we wait for attendees' questions, I also wanted to ask you, Boram, because I would say that when approaching care from a gender perspective, we too frequently approach it from the perspective of the caregiver or the person that we think is the caregiver, because as you said, we usually don't think about persons with disabilities as caregivers, and in fact they are, although their care provision is extremely extremely invisible. I was thinking that frequently we say that we've got like four aims with respect to care. First of them is recognizing care. The second one is reducing the situations of precarious care or care arrangements in precarious conditions, let's say, in low quality conditions. And with respect to that one, we always think about reducing the time that we devote to caregiving, for example, but we never talk, or we don't usually talk about reducing the need for care by promoting persons' autonomy. So, and as you were saying, prior to think about how to give better quality care, is the first step is to reduce the need for others' care by promoting personal autonomy, I guess, in both intellectual and physical terms. So I wanted to, if you could elaborate a bit more on that, on the need to promote persons' autonomy. And also, the fourth objective is to represent, so that people who are the leading characters of care arrangements are represented whenever any decision is made on how we want to deal with care and which kind of care services we want to implement or anything like that. And usually we think about caregivers as well, so that caregivers must be presented whenever we decide what to do with care. And you were talking about recognizing the role of caregivers, for example, but also persons with disabilities, but in their multiple identities. So it is not only to be represented or to be recognized as a legitimate actor, only in terms of being a caregiver or a care receiver, but in terms of our multiple identities. So if you, again, could elaborate a bit more on that, what does it mean? This idea of multiple identities and how it could impact this objective of representation. Thank you.
Okay, objective. Yeah, I think I understand your question, but if I start to answer, and if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free. I mean, Amaya, I think when I first I joined the introductory seminar, I think our sort of where our starting point is a little bit different, I think, from the point of view of a care economy. But I did like the 4 R's. I think the first was let me just look back at my notes, but and I think that they were quite also sort of, you know, from our perspective as well, I would say that these would be quite important for us as well, as recognizing care. And so that concept that I had first mentioned when I was talking about our recommendations is to validate and appreciate caregiving. So I would see that as being part of recognizing care, reducing precarious care arrangements. So from the perspective of SRHR, transportation, arduous care arrangements, and I think that's, from our perspective, we would see that from a, you know, a protection point of view about the sort of risk of violence, abuse, exploitation that's perpetrated both against persons with disabilities as well as caregivers. They often experience similar kinds of protection risks in humanitarian settings. I think that, I mean, in terms of autonomy, I'm not sure I can fully answer this question. I think we think about it from who are our sort of targets and our kind of advocacy targets that we would like to influence. And I think for us, it's really, if you follow the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it would be the states. So the states' obligations to ensure that these kinds of care arrangements, precarious care arrangements, are not there, or to reduce those kinds of care arrangements. And then humanitarian actors. So what kinds of activities, what kinds of programs and policies can ensure and can foster and strengthen their inclusion in the activities that they have going on. I think that was it. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, Amaya.
No, yeah, it's okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, and we've got more questions, so we can keep on with
Okay, sure.
Thanks a lot.
We now have one question from one of the participants. Her name is Edna, and let me read you the question. She says, Boram, could you please give us some examples of ways the different actors, state, market, community, and households can validate and appreciate caregivers? There is also so little information on the role of social capital in the context of caregiving. This is a question from Edna.
Sure. Edna, that's a great question. So I would say that for the states, I mean, we from a rights-based perspective, we think about the state as having the ultimate responsibility to ensure that quality support and assistance is provided to persons with disabilities, that they recognize in various ways the care arrangements that are present within their own countries. So I would say that could be anything from ensuring that where there are not quality care arrangements, that the state steps in and provides services, both either whether that's in-home residential or within the community, that those arrangements are provided for. From the market perspective, I think it's just to ensure that that those economic opportunities that are available to everyone is also available to caregiving, but we also promote kind of knowing that the various kinds of caregiving arrangements that exist within a household in displaced settings, that there may be a need to have a more targeted approach, that households hosting persons with disabilities might need to be targeted, both the person with disabilities to be considered in economic activities, economic empowerment activities, but also caregivers as well. So for the community and households, we know that these are oftentimes the things that kind of break down in a displaced setting. So during flight and after flight, that the community support mechanisms in households, the household structures that had existed previously are oftentimes not necessarily available. And so I think the responsibility, again, back to the state and humanitarian actors, is to rebuild those networks and strengthen those networks. And so in terms of, I think social capital, I think that's a very important point. I think it's what can states and what can humanitarian actors do to strengthen the social capital that might already exist in a community. And so these can be things like kind of developing peer support networks of caregivers to promote kind of trainings and activities where caregivers have a chance to meet together, to exchange about sort of the challenges that they face, to look at sort of supporting their mental health and psychosocial support, given that their increased risk of anxiety and stress in kind of displacement settings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We have another question by Carla Harris. She asks, since the convention was adopted, to what extent are states increasing their engagement in caregiving? I mean, do you know about any successful cases where states have launched a particular program policy that has improved the life of persons with disabilities or their caregivers?
Okay, let me try to answer this question. First, before I start, maybe I would just say, I don't think I mentioned it while I was speaking, but there is no actual direct reference to the word caregiving within the convention. I think this came from, there's a little bit of a background on this about the disability movement. They actually prefer the terminology assistance and support. And so when you're thinking about assistance and support, I think what I understand in situations where the state is acting, I think a lot of times that has to do with social services. For me, I think a lot of the research that we have is oftentimes in displaced settings, so I can't necessarily speak outside of that context. But for example, where we've seen examples where the state have provided a particular program or policy that's improved the lives of persons with disabilities and their caregivers is perhaps when states provide an option to both the household and the community about what kind of caregiving arrangements that they prefer, and based on the assessment of the household. So from like a case management, social services perspective, that they provide a variety of options, and depending on what those options are, that the household as well as the person with disabilities is able to choose what sorts of arrangements are best fitting for them.
Let me read you two more questions. They are from Victor. He asks, are there any positive examples of new community collective care structures formed in displacement that you observe in your research? What are the success factors in this regard? And then I will ask you the next one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've seen examples of where community and collective structures have been formed, and where they do successfully include persons with disabilities as well as their caregivers that we've observed. I think some of the positive or some of the success factors we would look at is when community mobilizers, so these would be, community workers or kind of representatives within the community who are directly linking with sort of community-based organizations, that sort of thing, are persons with disabilities themselves. I would also say when caregivers are part of the leadership structures of community groups, that they are also able to successfully advocate for their own inclusion as well as the people that they're caring for. What other examples? I think there are also, we've seen, sometimes in some cases we know that quotas can often work. We often have a working quota that we say that, at least 15 to 20% of any population is a person with disabilities. And if you say that you're working with the representative population, that within community leadership structures that persons with disabilities should be representative, and that would be the same for caregivers. So if you broaden that scope, they're quite larger representative proportion of people with disabilities and their caregivers in any given population. So the next question,
The next question, should I read it? Is when we talk about economic empowerment of caregivers, mostly women, as you mentioned, we probably should also consider that it could create additional burdens on them and other risks. What needs to be taken into consideration to reduce the potential risks?
I think, from our most recent report, we found that oftentimes, women and girls who are caregivers within a household in displaced settings are not often considered for various kinds of prevention activities. These can be prevention activities of gender-based violence, so they don't necessarily have access to the same information about how to prevent gender-based violence, what are some of the risks, how to recognize it, what to report, and where to go once the situation of violence has happened. And so I think when we consider female caregivers, we need to sort of think about how to design programs where we understand that they are often based in the home, that they don't necessarily have access to the same community and peer support networks that others within the community might have, and how to do targeted outreach towards them. So they might not be able to necessarily leave their homes. They might have to, you might have to go to them, for example. That could be another one. And as well, I mean, for economic empowerment, I'm sorry, I got a little bit off topic, but in terms of economic empowerment activities, this could be also a way that you kind of reduce some of the risk and prevent some of the protection risks from happening. And so to also consider them and target them for economic empowerment activities, while also looking at identifying and mitigating risks along the way.
Okay, thank you. I'm reading the next one. Is from Ximena. What kind of support would a state provide to caregivers of persons with disabilities under normal circumstances?
There could be a wide array of different kinds of support that a state would provide. This could be, you know, for example, I know that, you know, I live in the States, and my family is caring for my grandmother, and because they understand that there is, you know, certain costs associated for having the having my grandmother being hosted at home, that they provide medical insurance, for example, to my grandmother, and provide a small stipend to ensure that she is her health and her medical needs are covered. But it's a wide, you know, it's the same kinds of support I would imagine that any person non-disabled would need in a home. And I think that it's the responsibility ultimately of the state to ensure that those things are available.
Okay. Now we still don't have more questions from the participants. We'll leave you like 5 minutes to ask more questions. And now, I don't know, maybe I would like to share, because I read yesterday an article from an activist and researcher from the movement of people with disabilities, and she was her statement was that care could also imply a way of gender violence. I thought it was an interesting statement, because sometimes we talk about bringing care to the center of the organization of care, but sometimes she was speaking that sometimes care, in some cases, care could also imply a way of violence, no? In a sense that in the way in which it's implemented, it doesn't respect their autonomy, or they can afford situations of overprotection, or in which they are treated as a child. So I don't know, what do you think in this respect? What do you think about this statement?
I mean, I think that's right. I think that that can happen, and when you see a sort of breakdown in kinds of caregiving arrangements and the lack of those sorts of support and assistance available, we obviously are. We think it's important to think about the rights of caregivers, but also the rights of persons with disabilities who have, you know, the right to decide for themselves, the right to, you know, to choose what kinds of care arrangements that they have, for example, and sometimes in a situation where there are not adequate sorts of arrangements or kind of an understanding of these rights and how to provide care, quality care that is fully respective of persons with disabilities, we see that this can result in violence and abuse and exploitation, and we've seen that in our work as well. So it's, I think, oftentimes what we think is important is to think about the rights of individuals with disabilities as well as caregivers, and that it's often a balance. We seek a balance between those rights.
Okay, thank you very much. I have another question from Ximena. How to reconcile care services with the promotion of the autonomy of the people with disabilities?
I don't see that as a contentious relationship. I think that care, I think I heard Amaya say this before as well, that we often, everyone in their lives, in different phases of their lives and different circumstances, require care. And that doesn't mean that that is not necessarily in contention with the autonomy of anyone in particular. It's the right that we have as individuals and as protected as human rights, that we have the right to both receive and to give care. And so it's just that to what extent are we able to choose those things, the way that we're able to receive and give care for persons with disabilities and by persons with disabilities themselves. I think that's the important question for us.
Okay, thank you. We don't have more questions from the participants, but I think that Natalia from the team at the training center, she wants to ask you something.
Sure.
Is that okay, Natalia?
Not Natalia Alba, but me, Amaya.
Ah, okay. I thought it was Natalia. Sorry.
Sorry, no, it was me.
I was confused. Okay, sorry.
But I was thinking that the intersection between care, disability, and displacement is, I would say, a really an innovative one. I mean, it's too frequent that we approach displacement without taking gender into account, or that we approach disability without taking gender, or vice versa. But the intersection between the three of them is really a new one, I would say. So would you agree with me on that? That is an innovative intersection that we need to work more on it. And in this case, if that was the case, what would your recommendation be? Do we need more data? So do we need more research on this? Do we need more programming? So who would be responsible for that? Do we need changes in the big legal framework, in the conventions, for example? So what should be our starting point to approach this intersection?
Sure. Yeah, I think we do present kind of a complicated picture. I think definitely in the humanitarian sector, we often view these things in kind of in isolation. So if we are thinking about disability, we're not necessarily thinking of gender. If we're thinking of gender, we're not thinking of disability or displacement. And so presenting that sort of like kind of intersecting lens on all the work, I think is really, I think it's difficult from a kind of programming perspective or even from a legislative framework perspective. But I mean, I think that really depends what would be the starting point, who you are as an actor. So whether that's are you an advocacy organization? So definitely we would want to think about what kinds of advocacy messages do we want to present to policymakers, where we present that kind of complicated picture. I think in terms of what we do, where we go from here, I mean, I think we always start from this this point of view of ensuring that we're always consulting with women, children, for example, women, children, and youth, and persons with disabilities and all their intersecting identities, and that they're always, that's the starting point, that they're always considered in the consultations, in the design, and the implementation of programs, and then in the evaluation. To what extent have programs been able to capture, and what kind of changes have resulted in the lives of both individuals with disabilities, their caregivers, and within their communities. So I think that would be our starting point. I think from a data perspective, I mean, that's always a lot of what we hear, like in the kind of like policy and advocacy world, that we need more data, we need more data. I mean, we've done quite a number of research, and we have a lot of data available. I mean, we know overall the proportion of persons with disabilities. We know the proportion of people affected by crisis, by forced displacement. So for me, I think it's just about starting from the point of view of consultations and then working through that. throughout a project cycle.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we are going to close the online lecture today here because we don't have more questions for today. It has been very interesting, your presentation. You also bring so many innovative questions and interesting issues that we would never bring before in this course and series on care economy. So this is the first step to continue debating about this interaction between the different ways of oppression, gender, disability. So thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure to have you here, Boram, with us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure as well.
I hope we'll see you in next editions, and thanks everybody for coming. Before we close the webinar, we would like to remind you the next conference that will be next Tuesday, the 6th of June, at the same time at 9 o'clock a.m. New York time. And we will, Silke staff will be with us one more time. She's from the UN Women Policy Division, and she will talk about public policies on care, from assessment to action, rethinking public policies through a care lens. So see you next week. Have a nice week, all of you, and thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Boram. Thanks to all. Bye.
You.